Good morning and welcome to this one of the first Classical Next sessions, and welcome also, because these things are linked, to the Music Theatre Laboratory of the World, which is what this city is 10 days every year. My name's Neil Wallace. I'm the Programme Director of the Doelen, and I'll be moderating this session this morning. In the Classical Next programme, Tim Stilts was announced as a panel member. Tim has not been able to travel from Australia for family reasons, but we're very, very pleased and grateful that Sara Fang from Singapore has agreed to replace Tim this morning. Sara is a producer and principally a producer of the National Arts Centre in Singapore. On my left, the person who is right at the very middle, the mad professor himself of the Music Theatre Laboratory, Guy Coolen, festival programmer, intendant, producer, founder and director of Music Theatre Transparant in Belgium. And on my right, Beth Morrison, another, as we say in Dutch, spin in the web, a spider in the web, producer, programmer, festival director, Beth Morrison, projects in New York, and like Guy, internationally active in a very expansive way in the music theatre world. Now, we only have 45 minutes, and I'm intending to make the most effective use of those 45 minutes. So I want to get, as it were, I want to get to cruise height as quickly as possible as I can, not with detailed questions, but with quite bold and general questions. The title of the session is, as you know, the future of music, theatre, and opera. Well, hello, a week-long seminar. We're not going to do that. But what I do want to do, is just to try and touch and to get at some of the questions surrounding that future. What are the key things which are happening in the music theatre and opera world which are important to that future? Because I think if there's one thing that we generally agree about music theatre particularly, is that there's something so infinitely regenerative. There's a regenerative power about music theatre, which means that, generally speaking, it is artistically extremely healthy. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you don't have to spend too much time talking about the future of a healthy art form. You just get on and you do it. But at the same time, I am actually going to start that first question with this, departing from this title, the future of music theatre and opera, because that does tend to imply, Guy Coolen, it does tend to imply that the future of music and theatre and opera are essentially, the future is the same thing. But in music theatre now, in the last couple of days, you've spent lots of times debating the future of these art forms. So, in fact, they're not the same thing, or are they?
Yeah, well, we're not going to discuss the definition of music theatre and opera here.
Not again.
Not again, because I've been doing this for the last 20 years. And we last night, we, as Neil said, we had a 3-day session on new music theatre. It was a competition, and 450 people worldwide sent in their music theatre, and 18 winners were presented over the last 3 days. And we had a sort of a conclusion yesterday that we can't define it, because only from the 18 winners, about 18 different definitions were given, or people presented their piece as a rock opera, an installation opera, and what I was happy for yesterday, that we concluded, because when I started doing this job 20 years ago, there was a clear distinction between music theatre and opera, and the music theatre people didn't want to do anything with opera, but I think we can't do without it, but I think it's a different thing. What I'm happy for is that more and more opera houses around the world are opening a second space for smaller experiments or whatever, so what I see is, and you say this is a laboratory, that this is really necessary for the future of opera, that we have a healthy music theatre scene.
Would it be true to say that at some point in the earlier years, the development of music theatre, that it really was in opposition to something, let's say mainstream like opera? Was there ever a point where that was the case? Is it perhaps still the case? Is it in opposition to something, or has it just become its own indefinable art form?
Yeah, what I said, it's so wide. I think a lot of the composers we had in the competition are definitely wanting to write a big opera once in their life. So there's a movement they make. But from the 450 applications we had, about 300 were actually not really composed music in a traditional way. There were a lot of singer-songwriters. So we see in the whole field of music theatre worldwide a difference than what we traditionally think of opera, but a lot of people call it opera. So it's also there, it's already a shift. But I don't feel the aggression anymore because of the, and it's also because the major opera houses, or some of the major opera houses, have the openness now. So I think they embracing the smaller projects. And I think, well, we've seen what happened in the last 20 years in music theatre. It's also influencing what's happening on the main stage in big opera houses. So, and I think this is a good win-win situation.
Beth, when we started to talk about this, you mentioned a couple of times that for you there's actually a third term, maybe not a third definition, but there's a third term, something between music theatre and opera, which you call new opera, or
opera theatre.
Opera theatre.
Yeah,
tell us about that. What is this distinction?
Well, I think the term music theatre has resonance in the industry, and certainly in Europe, it's sort of its own defined thing. It's a little bit muddled in the United States because we have musical theatre, which is more along the lines of Broadway or Stephen Sondheim, these kinds of composers. So when we use music theater in the United States, it tends to mean more avant-garde. Opera has its own very distinct connotations that I think resonate throughout the whole world. I think in locating younger audiences, that term opera can often be off-putting. It seems to signify something that is untouchable, something that exists in some ivory tower theater that isn't attainable, or that is so confined by traditions that it doesn't appeal. So in my festival Prototype, and in my work with my company Beth Morrison Projects, we call what we do opera theater, so opera-theater. And what does that mean? It doesn't really mean anything. It can mean whatever you want it to, but what I want it to signify is that it's something different. So when you see that term opera theater, even if you don't know what it means, you know it's not your standard traditional opera experience. And so you're coming in to the theater or wherever the piece is being performed with no expectations, because you don't know what opera theater is. So then we've sort of disarmed the expectations and hopefully keep the minds open to some sort of different kind of experience.
I think it's generally true to say, isn't it, that there's a huge amount of progress being made, particularly with orchestras and concert halls, with staged work. Is that a fair general?
Well, I mean, I think I think that that's an optimistic statement. I think there are certainly examples of that. In the United States, the LA Phil is really the shining example of that. They are, in my opinion, probably the most progressive institution in the United States. And what they do, I saw a John Adams piece there that had electronic music. There were no live musicians, and it was a dance piece. So they're really cracking open what the notion of an orchestra can do. How does it relate to the community on a different platform? And I think they're a shining example of that.
Sara, how does all this look from an Asian perspective? I mean, what would a member of a Singapore audience of a National Arts Centre understand by the term music theatre?
Good morning, first of all. I think when I was first invited to be part of this panel to look over 450 applications, I realized that we actually are pretty light years away from what the Europeans and or the Americans imagine music theater to be. Because when I asked myself that question from an Asian's perspective, we don't really have this term called music theater. In Singapore, opera is still considered a really niche art form. We have very little audiences for it. We have one semi-professional opera company and a few hobbyist groups, amateur groups, but that's essentially what opera means and where opera stands in Singapore. So if opera is already at this sort of nascent stage for us, compared to that, music theater is not even definable because nobody has a benchmark from which to kind of look at and go, oh, so that's opera, so I'm doing something different than opera, and therefore it's this form kind of loosely called music theater. So I'd say, in short, at least specific to Singapore, it's not really defined. That there isn't really.
All I can say is lucky you. Just I want to push you a little bit on this. I mean, out there in the artistic community, all these young artists, these makers who are working in all kinds of disciplines. I mean, are there any telltale signs or early developments of people who are mixing genres in this way and not calling it anything?
I mean, I think that's a great segue because I think more and more young people are starting to break down the barriers. When I was growing up in the 90s or 80s and 90s, they tend to be siloed into their various genres, whether it's music, theater, dance, et cetera, and hopefully more and more young people nowadays are starting to going into multidisciplinary work, which for some of us that live in Europe, and it's almost like a natural thing to do, but not necessarily in the Asian context. I mean, musicians are still very much largely in the music realm and dancers and theater. So I'd like to see, and I think we are seeing more and more young people sort of going together and coming up with things together, not necessarily having a label for it, not saying that this is music theater or dance theater, but this is just a new work, a new creation. And hopefully that will propel audiences to embrace it and to enjoy this form.
There's an unwritten agreement not to get bogged down in definitions, and we're not going to do that, but I am going to take a risk by suggesting to you that, in fact, there is something about music theatre as a form which is quite unique, and certainly unique if you place it beside opera or opera traditions. And that is locality, the sense of locality. I mean, the question of where music theatre is being made, who is making it, and who is not only watching it, but possibly participating in it. Is this really one of the USPs of music theatre?
Well, I can talk about the festival here. We started the festival about 10 years ago, and Rotterdam is a city without opera house. There was a question to me was to write a paper about whether we need an opera house or not. And I said, no, first build an audience, because we would have a wonderful opera house, but there would be definitely no budget to put on good opera. And we are in a country here where there's not a lot of tradition in opera, and there's a good opera house in Amsterdam, and people who want to see good opera can go to Amsterdam. And we thought we'd create...
And a great touring company.
And a great touring company, I forget that. And I said, let's try to create a new audience for a new form of music theatre and opera in a different way. And I think in the last 10 years we failed a lot, but we also succeeded, and we found an audience which is not necessarily only young people, but old people as well. We first attempted to get the people from the Doelen here, but that we forgot about in the first place, and now we're winning them back because they thought, yes, great, an opera festival, but we didn't put any proper opera on. But I give you one example of Locality. This weekend, when we opened, we did a large Parsifal project, which we did over the last 3 years. So we took the big opera. We didn't put the Parsifal of Wagner on, but we started with the theme of Parsifal and the music, and we asked a lot of different groups in the city to work on it with us. And it became a 3-part piece on 3 different locations in the city, an old theater in an old office building, and you've probably seen the steps already, which was not built especially for us, but we tried to get the steps because the last part was on the roof. And during the piece there was also a procession in the city, and Neil was saying what I liked, that there was people watching Parsifal. And then all of a sudden the whole city is talking about this project now, and it became people who never go to the opera talk about the opera, and that's a thing that you of course can achieve by going out of a theater.
And here's a tricky question. I mean, looking at that spectacle, it was extraordinary. All these people in this very Parsifal Wagnerian way, climbing this extraordinary staircase. It felt even more Parsifal than Bayreuth to me. And people watching. Was it artistically successful? And how would you judge that?
Well, I think so. Yes, of course, it became a community thing, but it's not a community piece like a lot of other community pieces, because it was really, we asked a composer to rescore Wagner. We used very good singers. We used also children's, but we also used the semi-amateur opera choir. For me, it was artistically because that was what we intended to do. I'm very happy you mentioned the word spectacle, because after the presentations yesterday, we had a closing and debate, and people said, well, the music theatre of now is becoming more spectacle, but somebody else said that's what opera was always about, because we always in opera used the newest forms of, and if Mozart would have had video, he probably would have used video, but because a lot of the music theatre pieces we shown were only with new media, and in Parsifal, luckily there were not new media, it was mainly people doing it.
And just to touch briefly again, the title, I imagine then that for the Opera Dagen and the architects of programming, the principles of the success of Parsifal are things which you won't let go. You'll take these on in future projects.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's also because in the evening we did a very serious, almost elitist performance, but it's the same audience. That's what we want to achieve in the city. And because we built the audience from, because you were laughing, you're right that we don't have to burden of that there's no opera house is a good thing for us, because there's no tradition. We don't have to destroy the tradition. We can build a new audience. And
I should come clean. I mean, it wasn't an anti-opera statement at all.
No, absolutely not.
But the Opera Dagen has brought opera, music theatre and the public much further, I would argue, than a conventional opera house might have done.
Absolutely, yeah. Of course we love opera, and I told the mayor, because he opened the Parsifal, what my dream would be is to have a proper Parsifal next to a Parsifal like this. This would be the ideal for me.
A proper Parsifal. That's an interesting debate.
Full scale.
Beth, just let's look at it from your point of view. Locality. I mean, there you are, right in the heart of urban New York, Manhattan, a lot of the time, not always. What does Locality mean for you as a producer and the kind of work that you bring out?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, one of the things that Prototype, my festival, has always been about is black box opera. We do opera in some larger spaces now for projects that require it. But having an experience with opera in a black box space or in a club environment makes the experience completely different, because you're on top of it as an audience member. So for New York, if your experience with opera has only been the Metropolitan Opera in a 3,200 or something seat Elena, 3,400 seat house, where you feel so far removed that you know are wishing, even if you don't have them, that you did have opera goggles, opera glasses. And then you take that person who's only had that experience and you put them in a 200-seat black box space, and they're still singing in a bel canto style, but they're able to see all of their facial expressions, and they're essentially now in the drama because the space is so small. And people have had a very visceral reactions to this. We started the festival in 2013. The leading critic for the New York Times, Anthony Tomasini, came in and reviewed our world premiere, which was in a black box, and he really had a lot to say about that experience and how it is very different and how it is something very viable and something that he didn't expect to be so exciting as it was. So I think locale is something really important. There's something else, though, that I know we're not wanting to touch on so much, but I do think music theater and opera or opera theater, there is a definition in my mind about it. And I'm not going to talk about definitions, but just to say that for me, the way that I come into that and my way into those terms is that if you add opera to the word, whether it's opera or opera theater, to me that signifies serious composition and composers who have had serious musical training and have serious musical chops. Music theater is often not that. Oftentimes it's soundscape, sound design, other kinds of music. And so for me, that is what actually defines those things.
Okay.
Let me just also want to say one quick thing. When I first came to the Opera Dagen 5 years ago, my takeaway from it was there was no opera happening. And because I didn't see any serious music that was happening. Now, it didn't color my experience negatively at all because I was completely enthralled and totally besotted with what I was seeing. And so the takeaway inspired me tremendously. But I think the question of like, is music theater pushing opera? I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay, well, you obviously didn't see the Doelen shows in that thing. Yeah, it's interesting. Guy, just come back on that. I mean, the question of Beth seems to be saying actually, it's too easy to say everything is potentially music theatre. Her bandwidth is actually, it's about, in the end, it's about serious composition. We will come back to the composer's issue in a second. It's a thing I really want to look at. Have we learned that with the Opera Dagen? Do we also take that position in the Opera Dagen? We're really going for serious composition, or are the options still much more open for you?
Well, if we come back to the winners of the competition, and the final discussion yesterday was also there's not enough true composed music. The last one, Annelies van Parijs, who was one of the winners, was probably the only composer. There were several well-composed pieces, but she explained how she made her composition, and people in the auditorium were happy that the composer explained how she did it. She explained all the characters and what the tonalities and the instruments were linked. But I had a discussion afterwards with the people who were less like in the composing in a traditional style, and they said our singer-songwriters' pieces are also very complex in our way, so you shouldn't judge on not being serious music. So I think I'm much more on that side, that I like the openness and I respect all the styles. And we're talking with Beth a lot, because here a lot of young composers come to me and I want to write an opera. And in the traditional sense of the word, it's not an opera at all, but I don't care, because I think it also opens a discussion. What is it, opera? And
I suppose in some sense it's, we will come to this later, but it is in a sense, it's not meant cynically, bad news for ambitious composers, that a lot of the most exciting music theatre we see is inspired by repertoire 800, 600, 500, 200 years, 100 years old.
Well, also, like, just to say that the 18 winners, the 3 American projects were all with serious composers, and it's because we don't have the same kind of music theater tradition that's happening in Europe. It's actually different.
Yeah. Sara, is there, in your working environment, is there any sense of a hunger, ambition from artists of any sort to be composing opera or music theatre or whatever you want to call it? Are you besieged with,
I wouldn't necessarily
ambitious-
use that word, no. But there is definitely a curiosity. I think there's a growing excitement, especially amongst the younger artists, to dabble and to explore. I think sometime later this year, in November, December, the Wagnerian Society in Singapore is going to stage maybe, arguably, the first Wagner opera in Singapore, and it's a Flying Dutchman. And we're going to see a restaging of it. It in an Asian Singapore context by two noted Singapore directors, and it's going to have a cast of Singaporean singers. And we're inviting the winners from the Wagnerian competition to come down and perform as part of this production too. So for us, I mean, that's huge. I mean, that's a step in the right.
But do you
wrong,
see?
in the,
Wonderful. We have a very large staircase for sale, which might be of use in a production if you want. Could use it in almost any Wagner opera. No, but seriously, as a producer, as a programmer, do you have any instinct to start building some small things around something like that? Is that an option for you, even?
I mean, I think we have to. There is a company. So I represent the Esplanade, but if I may just talk a little bit about Singapore in general. There's a company called the New Opera Company. They are young. They've only been around for 3 or 4 years in Singapore. They have decided to go the guerrilla way, which is to bring opera out. So they performed in shopping malls. They have played in very, very unconventional spaces, which to many people may seem, kind of been there, done that, right? But for us, that is unusual. And for us, that's new. And this group is also very much about championing operas that otherwise you wouldn't see. So
Okay.
I think the thrust for them is to be able to excite and get people to break down this notion that opera is meant just for the elitists, meant for a certain class of people, and to be able to enjoy it from a, as Beth said, from a visceral level, from an up close and personal level, and that it doesn't have to seem so far away. The Esplanade, which is where I work, we're the National Performing Arts Center. The Esplanade Presents, which is, so there's a team of us, about 40, that programs 17 different series and festivals across the year, and we don't actually do very much classical music per se. Only 2 to 3% of it is classical, but that's Western classical. So we also take care of the Chinese, Malay, Indian classical works, the 3 main race and ethnicities and cultures that make up Singapore. So when you add all those together, classical and what classical means, then we do a far more than that. But 2% Western classical most of the time.
But it sounds like the perfect environment to start exploding things a little, isn't it? I mean, yeah.
I mean,
introducing new things.
I think there's definitely a lot of cross-pollination that's possible. I think when you live in a sort of melting pot place like ours, where the common language is English and everybody's able to communicate with each other, that it makes it easier. But having said that, so I have a lot of hopes for the younger generation to be able to actually do that, a lot more of that.
Just a tiny little pause, because I'm going to say something which you don't know. Now you do, is that before we started this debate, I told Beth and Guy, Sara unfortunately wasn't at the pre-discussion, I'm going to put the same question to both of them at the end of this debate, the same question. And the question is, what is the essence of your mission for music theatre in 5 years' time? So I'm just announcing that so that you can think about it, because I think you've got the most interesting answer to that question in a minute. Beth, I just want to touch on something arising from last night. I think a lot of us who were in the hall at the opening last night were really quite inspired by your cri de coeur, which is essentially a political plea in the sense of the small p about what the hell are we all doing in making classical music more relevant to wider society, let's say. would it be true to say that music theatre has a real role, I mean, a really exciting role to play in what I would just generally call struggle? I mean, struggle, community struggle, political struggle, places of pain?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I mean, I think theater has held that place for hundreds of years, and certainly, you think of like Theater of the Oppressed and that treatise and tradition. But I think music theater has a unique place in telling stories, and I think because music is a universal language that cuts across class, that it has an even broader potential.
This is very profound, what you're saying, cutting across class.
Yeah.
Can you give us examples of where you see that happening in the States?
Sure, yeah. Actually, I have a wonderful example. So my partner, who is a conductor who works on a worldwide platform in social justice, he started a prison program in Massachusetts, and he brought me in one day to kind of witness this day of concertizing that he had programmed. Now, most of what he was doing is actually quite practical in the classroom for a group of about 30 men. This thing that I came in to witness was something programmed for the entire prison population, which was about maybe 400 actually. So I walked into a room, I was the only woman there. The entire audience was Black and Latino. And my partner, he had brought in students from Boston University, where he's a professor. He had brought in African American students that were, in that moment, playing Bach. And it was a cellist and a harpist, both male. And at the end of the performance, the entire room erupted. They stood on their feet. They were like going crazy, just clapping, encore, 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 and shouting things like, "Can you imagine a brother can do that?" And they literally have never had exposure to this music before. And the fact that the access was granted touched them. And there are hundreds of these stories, and this is just one. But access is truly important, and we say that classical music is quote unquote, I do not, but people say quote unquote classical music is dying out. When you see a room like that is full of people who never had the opportunity to know classical music respond in that way, it becomes very clear that it's all about access with a capital A.
Yeah. Let's not forget that there are people in the music theatre community who actually do almost nothing else.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm thinking of companies like Pimlico Opera, who spend a lot of their time in prisons and working in this incredibly liberating way. Guy, what's this like from Opera Dacha perspective or Music Theatre Transparent?
Well,
struggle.
Yeah, the struggle. Well, the city project I explained is already working, so that's fine. But what the struggle is, we're living in a city here where there are so many different communities. We work with some of the communities, like there's a strong Chinese population, and we did a theme around Chinese opera, and we worked in the Chinese area. And we also tried to bring different pieces linked to China, but it's because we found out, and nobody knew, that there are 3 Chinese opera companies here in Rotterdam. But they're traditional, but we brought new things in. But I have a bit of a problem by putting on things for different communities. So what we decided is from next year on, we will focus more on what's happening in the world, and we will have people from the different communities to curate with me, because I think we can only learn from them, because we shouldn't stop doing things for the communities.
Couldn't we really conclude that the application of music theatre is really the ultimate community art form? I mean, that's a big statement. Couldn't we conclude that? I mean, if we hear about these experiences, everything from self-expression, self-discovery, I have a voice, never sung in my life.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I think everybody does have a voice, and therefore can make noise and make sound and come together and do that. I also think, though, that we have a unique experience as professional theater makers, to also have an opportunity to bring forward political issues in our society, which I think is actually kind of doing also the same kind of thing. I have a piece called Thumbprint, which is a piece about Mukhtar Mai, a wonderful women's rights activist in Pakistan who was gang raped and brought her perpetrators to justice, which isn't done in Pakistan. You know, usually your family kills you or exiles you. This is very hopeful story, and one that was picked up by something like 126 news outlets around the world because it had resonance. And so I think also as opera and music theater producers, we have the responsibility and the opportunity to put forward bigger ideas and ideas that should be thought about and that should hopefully resonate with a contemporary audience.
Okay. Let's just come back to this word regenerative. I mean, if it is truly a regenerative art form, that suggests that it's creating new generations, it's creating new thinking. And I want to focus a little on composers. Is it the case that the music theatre forums are developing a new kind of composer or allowing composers to work in new idioms?
Well, there's an interesting discussion I always have with Beth, because bringing over American work here and whether it will work here, and then Beth said, yeah, but the work the Europeans are doing is interesting, but it wouldn't work in America because it's too complex. And what I like is that a lot of the composers I work with for the last 20 years are also shifting. They're more going to a language that is finding a larger audience, and the composers, and really wanting, and we've heard it, telling stories again, because it's been for a long time very abstract music theatre, and especially also the new operas. But most of the composers I work with, they want to find a new way to communicate with a larger audience, because they've sort of had it presenting their work for 20 people, and I think that's for me that's a very interesting shift, that the contemporary composer is not another world anymore, because that's why I'm only happy with what I said in the beginning, that so many opera houses are giving the chance in a second space or whatever to integrate these new compositions.
So are you also saying that one of the additional benefits of music theatre is that it creates a wider audience for music or the work of composers that might otherwise have been ignored or not appreciated? Is there an evangelical impulse of some kind there for new composition?
Well, yes, but it's also, I think, because there's so much more possibilities, so we can give the chance to much more people to do it, and the composers see the advantage of it, because most of the composers, if they're writing small chamber music, but they see that the multimedia event or the opportunities is attracting a larger audience, and that in combination that they want to tell a story with their music is something that I see at least with most composers here in Europe.
Beth, you nailed your colours to the mast at the beginning about working with real, serious composers or serious music, serious composition. What about this question for you? New type of composer, new type of idiom emerging for music theatre?
Yeah, I think it's less. Pronounced in the U.S. Quite honestly, the sort of European music theatre style just doesn't exist in the same way. So I think that the people who are creating music theatre in the States are really seriously trained composers by and large. Of course, there are sound artists and sound designers who create music theater projects, and but that's less, quote unquote, music in a way. And coming here and being exposed to the European music theater tradition of really like a lot of spoken text underscored by music, is just not something that is as prevalent in the States at all.
Right.
Can I react to that? Because Beth was always saying a European style, but we had a 3-day discussion of that. There's no European style because we had a lot of British groups over, and it's a completely
That's not European.
No,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, well,
Or it won't be- won't be from the 23rd of June.
as
But
usual, though, the English are and the Americans are pretty close.
I know, but also the Germans that were there yesterday. That the Dutch and the Belgians are too funny in their music theater because they said that German it's not accepting. It's a serious music theater.
Okay, so you have a 3-act opera, and each act can't be shorter than 60 minutes. You mean that sort of serious? Yeah, yeah. And another just side question here is, of course, is where composers appear in the process of making a music theatre piece. I mean, Strauss just had an idea called Hoffman style and started renting theatres.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think this is actually the sort of new opera movement that has taken over in the United States. I think was absolutely begun by a young generation of composers in their 20s who weren't satisfied with waiting until they were 40 to write their first opera. And so they just started writing, and they started self-producing in churches and clubs, and it was also a time when I was starting my company, and so we kind of found each other, and I started producing a lot of them. And then we kind of grew each other up. I think there's less. I think these things kind of come in waves, and I think that crop of young composers 10 years ago have now become the leaders of their generation and are creating opera now for larger companies as well. So I think that sort of restlessness and that entrepreneurial impulse, which I think is so important for young musicians across the board, really is what sparked the new American opera movement.
Okay. Now, we're running out of time, so I'd just like a very brief response from you on this question before we go to the closing question. I mean, it's not all good news. It can't all be good news about this art form, this genre. And what I'm interested in is, I mean, what's not working? I mean, is there in any sense that this pioneering art form does have a conservative side? That there's even paralysis of some sort?
Well, certainly in the U.S., there's this massive explosion of new opera being created. Is all of it good? No. But there's a lot of it being created, and a lot of it is very, very good. And maybe much more importantly is most of the companies in the States recognize that actually they need to be contributing to the repertoire, and they are commissioning, and they are doing new projects. But of course, there continues to be the doom and gloom of, the Met just announced that they've only sold 65% of their seats this year, which is down from 80% from last year. I mean, it's just dreadful news. But the large companies who are looking at a 21st century model and are understanding that finding second spaces, finding smaller spaces to create new work is actually generative for the art form and the audiences. So I have a partnership with LA Opera. We do my projects in a black box space near the main hall, and the head of LA Opera said that the most exciting thing about the initiative is that he doesn't know 75% of the audience.
Victory. Guy, just very quickly, conservatism, paralysis in the Netherlands or the Flanders?
Absolutely. No.
Absolutely yes or absolutely no?
Yes, but not by the makers. We see that there are more and more makers making good work, sometimes bad work, but there's an energy, and I think we need that, and half of them don't fail. But most of these people making work can't show their work. There's us, and in the rest of the Netherlands, there's only maybe 2 or 3 venues that dare to take the risk to present because they think it's too adventurous for their audience. It's the same happening in Belgium. And I'm happy, and I'm just saying that the Netherlands Opera now started also a festival called Opera Forward. These are signals also from Pierre Audi to say, well, it's necessary, and we try to convince other theatres to stimulate it as well.
Okay. The mission question. Beth, what's the essence of your mission for music theatre in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so since you asked this question to us about an hour ago to think about, the first thing that popped into my head is still what I'm going with, which is that I think it's our responsibility as producers to let the artists lead. And so I'm going where the artists are going to take me.
Wonderful. Guy.
Well, Beth said that she showed up 5 years ago, and I asked her afterwards, what do you think? And she said, you're a non-dogmatic festival.
Non-dogmatic festival.
Yes, and so she gave me my mission. And I think my mission is now to convince other people to be less dogmatic and to play for the opera houses and the other venues to be more open and to give a platform to the young artists, or the artists in general.
Sara.
I think the fact that I'm even here and that I have two colleagues from the National Arts Council in Singapore that are here as part of Classical Nix is a move in the right direction. That we start to get to know what the rest of the world is doing, and that we can go back and help to change mindsets a little step at a time. And also for me, in the next 5 years, to be able to hopefully encourage more original content creation, and to build audiences along the way, which is something that is very hard to do, but yeah, essential.
Okay. All right, let's just jump in. Come on, who's got a question? Let's go with the questions first rather than the comments, given the lack of time.
Well, thank you for all your input. I was wondering, because we're living in such a visualized world and we're not reading anymore, we're just looking at pictures and videos, to what extent you feel is the visual aspect of music theater actually the aspect that might attract new audiences?
From my perspective, I would say that probably 99% of what I do is a multimedia experience of some sort, which tends to involve video and sound design. I think that a lot of what's happening in new opera in the traditional companies in America is that they have not found their way into the media. For me, the media makes it feel much more 21st century and current. So it's an aesthetic that's very important to my work.
Guy?
Yeah, the same. But yesterday, at the closing session, we said we have to be careful not to be trapped in the new media. But I think we're exploring things now, so it's overwhelming what's happening, and not everything is good. But I think we'll see, and I trust it will go on the right way, not the wrong way, because we've seen a few things that I haven't experienced yet, and I think it will open up because there was a piece with headphones and hearing sounds around you, so it will be so exciting and connecting to a new audience, I'm sure. But that doesn't mean, because there were also pieces without, that we shouldn't support pieces without, because it's also the beauty of it can be just one person on stage.
It comes down to the integrity of the idea, doesn't it, really?
Absolutely.
It does, but because Beth is stressing serious composition so much, I was wondering, is there a component called serious visuals as well that you're trying to get the balance?
No.
Just a question for you, Mark. I mean, you're a visual artist, and your whole company is actually founded on everything to do with image. Has that meant a lot to you in terms of approaching music theatre or new music?
It has, actually. I think the visual can or should be a much more part of the communication to search for new audiences, because the subjects can be so difficult or feel so elitist, and that shouldn't be become a threshold. So getting them in with the visuals or with the technique is not a threat or something bad, but as long as you get them in.
Can I say something? Because
very quick.
Yes, very quick. I mean, it's important because we discussed it. I think that the role of music theatre, we talked about music theatre opera, but also for orchestras. I'm happy that orchestras are also coming to us and to ask us, because in the past years I've seen such a horrible vision things by making orchestras a bit more lively, but the investment in the quality of the work is sometimes so poor. As for music theatre, it's part of the music theatre.
I think we all endorse that. Yeah.
And we're happy that finally we get questions help us. Like we're going to do the project tomorrow with Rotterdam Philharmonic. They came to us asking, can you advise people, because otherwise it's just an image with music, and that's what we have to avoid.
Okay. I want to bring in Kathy Boyd at one point because she took part in our breakfast discussion. Not yet, though. There's a few hands. Vanessa Lan at the back, composer. A question.
Hi, I'm a composer, and I also think I'm very serious at times. But I have a question about the education of young composers, because I can think of nothing more in a box and nothing more unfortunately stuck in the past than many conservatorium programs for training people who write music. I'm wondering if people have a suggestion of how we can bring multidisciplinary music, opera, theater, everything into
how we train people.
the training programs and ideas about possibilities.
Yep.
I think it's an amazing point, and I think it's actually not just with composition. I think it's across the board for performers as well. I don't think performers are being trained in a 21st century model. I think for the most part, conservatories are stuck in the 19th century, and they haven't even graduated into the 20th century. So I think it's a huge problem. I completely agree with you. I don't exactly know how to change it because I also think conservatories are conservative, and it's hard to move them. There are examples that can be pointed to that are the exceptions, and I think those exceptions need to shout very loudly.
We have to be grateful for those because they are there,
Yeah, they
including
definitely
in
are.
this city.
Yeah, but I think it's our task because we've complained a lot about it, but we weren't very active and now the Parsifal project was with the conservatory, but also with my company in Antwerp. We work with the conservatory in Antwerp. Now we suggested things, and little by little it's happening, and it's important for the students that they can do things in the real world.
Yeah, but it's a mer à boire. There's a lot to do. Yeah. The message is get out and do it, and then of course the education architects will probably follow. That's just to be the way it works. Next question, please. There were about 9 hands in the air 5 minutes ago. There's one there.
Hi, good morning.
Who are you?
Good morning. My name is Nicole Jordan, and I'm an artistic director and soprano of the Alchemy Ensemble. And I'm also artistic research coach at Codarts Conservatory. So, in fact, to address your question, maybe check Codarts, okay? Thanks. My question is actually about singers. You talk about opera and music theater and everything, and actually you're talking about so many other disciplines. And for me, of course, the importance is the core, is the voice.
Yeah, we
is the
kind of missed
singer.
that, didn't we?
Yeah, it's a pretty big thing. So I'd like you to at least touch on it. And
What would you like to know?
Yeah, actually, the question really is how are you managing this balance between highly trained, serious trained singers and the pop world, what a regular audience and not non-typical opera audience, let's say, would want to hear on stage? How do you deal with amplification? How do you deal with all of the details that come along with trained versus untrained voices and the expectations?
It's really the same question that I asked about composers, isn't
Exactly,
it?
yeah, it
Are
relates to
we
that too.
creating a new generation of singing talent, of vocal talent?
Indeed,
Guy?
In the projects we presented, people said it seems that there's only one singer. It's always Clara McFadden, and she's by accident. She's one of our ambassadors for the festival, but it's not. There's a reason why, because what composers are looking for are singers that are so open that they can sing perfect pitch, but they can also sing jazz. And I think what you do in Codarts is great, but not most conservatories are still training singers to sing in the Scala, and it will never happen for them. But then they have to start again by finding other possibilities, and luckily a lot of the singers accept that now, that that the diversity of their voice is important, but that's also a task we have to connect. That's why I said to the conservatives in the beginning of their education, that we tell them that that's the sort of singer we need. But I think it's so important, that's because in a lot of the cases that's a problem I have, that we use singers, or we have to use singers that are not well trained. So we need a good education, even though they will go far beyond the classical repertoire. It's so good that they know how to sing.
I think diversity is the key. You hit on it with that word. I mean, I
Yes.
think that young singers need to be trained to be diverse, and I would say 95% of the work I do is actually amplified,
Yeah.
but most of the
Still.
singers I work with sing in a bel canto style. So it's not amplified to hear them. It's amplified as an aesthetic choice by the composer to fit in with the rest of the aesthetic of the orchestra and such. So, but I think the more diverse a singer can be, if they can sing in a pop style, if they can sing with straight tone, if they can sing full bel canto, they just get more gigs.
They make a living. Yeah. Yes, sir. Who are you?
Robert Friedman, San Francisco,
Yeah.
worked around opera
Yeah.
and music for about 50 years. The SF Opera was getting a lot of flack for using amplification when they were doing Sweeney Todd. And it seems to me the real division, they did also, they've been incorporating musicals now almost every year. The problem is the critics are saying we don't want amplification. There's a division between musical theater, which is amplified, and opera with operatic voices. It's not the same. I am dogmatic too. I would rather hear in an opera house a trained voice, an operatic voice, and not amplification. Although we have the Meyer sound, which is one of the greatest sounds in the world, so it's hard. Sound is getting better as well. It's not just.
But what happens when the composers that are writing for an amplified sound,
That's
even
right.
if it's trained?
Sampled sound.
That's
and
right.
So what that says to me is that the audiences and the critics need to advance with the times. Like what I said is I want
Yeah.
the artists to lead. If the artists are leading and they're writing that, well, we have to follow.
Do you see a wider point in this, or do you even have a question
think
about
it's-
vocal technique and
Yeah,
how it actually needs to be more diverse these days? So.
I was trained in opera too, and I sang pop. I had a rock band. I did from Bob Dylan to Pavarotti, but not that I was either.
Pavarotti covers?
I saw his first performance in America, and it changed my perception of great tenors. But the problem is, to me, is there's a purity about a sound without amplification. And I understand if you want to have amplification, it's a choice, it's another sound. But I want to see both. I don't want to have.
I don't think it
But
has
you-
to be an either-or proposition. I think it's an and. And I think San Francisco Opera's in for a really big shock when I bring my piece, The Source, there next year, which is not only amplified, but is highly vocally processed.
Are you going to be in the small?
Yeah, in a small new
the-
space.
I mean, look, the general point is, do you or do you not endorse that huge amount of music theatre?
I like
is
it
just
all.
No, just a second. Is actually based upon different ideas of vocal technique and extended vocal techniques, including sampled voice. I mean, that's just a fact of life in our
Yes.
music theatre world, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Question at the back. Yes.
Hi, Andre Greenwell. I'm a composer and performance maker from Australia. I'm just contributing to that discussion. I'm not a trained singer. I sing in my projects with trained sopranos, classical, baroque, rock. So I'm quite used to blending vocalists. But what I find when I'm looking for singers to work with is performativity. This is really critical, and it's something I think in the discussion about training is the connection to the body. There's a lot of vocal training which is about the head up, and for me, I look for singers where I see the personality in the voice when the person performs, and that is for me what is really engaging for audiences in the experience of music theatre performance. I just wanted to.
Hi, I'm Elaine Mitchener, and I'm a Classical Next Fellow, and I'm a vocalist. And I trained in classical style, but I've been lucky to have come from gospel singing, jazz singing, free improv background, and have melded those styles to do what I do now. But having come through the training, classical training, it's a frustration for singers who have other interests, because that's often squashed at the conservatoire. If you are able to sing in other styles and do those well and convincingly, you're often regarded as not being able to sing properly. And there was a train of thought for a long time that singers who can't sing correctly only sang early music or contemporary new music, and everyone else sang bel canto, which I hope is changing, but I don't think it is. But from time immemorial, composers have been inspired by opera composers have been inspired by the vocalists that they're writing for. Those have been their muses, and I don't see why that should change now. And just going back to, I'm sorry, the lady in the blue, as a composer, and talk about what's happening in conservatoires, and that they need to be encouraged to be more open. If you're curious, you will seek the sound that you're looking for. You'll look for the artists that you want to work for to realize your work. And it means taking risks, and it means not being confined by the conservatoire training, and once post that, doing your own thing.
Aren't we really, can I interrupt you? It's not depressing what you're saying, but it paints a black picture. Couldn't we really be saying that the best chances for singers of a new generation is outside the conservatories, that it's out there in the big
The problem
world?
is that if you have to audition, because every singer wants to sing, at a major opera house, they want to do that. It's what you have been trained. That is all you know about. So you turn up for an audition, but you haven't done the round of competitions. You haven't come through the same route as everyone else, and therefore you're discriminated against because your CV doesn't reflect what the panel are expecting. There are exceptions to that, and this is not a personal thing, but it is a real fight for composers. Contemporary music theatre in the UK, it's a very small niche field, and it's done in small environments and with small budgets, and it's not, it's fights to be regarded seriously, taken seriously. But it also means that composers have to really fight to work with artists who are not coming from the classical training, if they want to realise a sound that they are hearing in their heads. And that goes with what Beth is saying about the artist leading. But it's convincing the producers, the people with the money, the commissioners, to support those.
Well,
That's
it happens in time.
Well,
it happens in time, but it has to become popular enough to get them.
It's a big bad world here too. I mean, let's be very honest about this. And I mean, these conditions are not unique to the UK or to other cultures.
I know that.
It's the school of hard knocks. That's what it's essentially about, whether you're an individual artist or a composer or whatever it might be. Thanks very much. I might come back to you, actually, if you hang around at the end of this, and suggest, just at the very end, just give us 2 or 3 points of the syllabus or the kind of course that you would like to see singers getting. Maybe have a think about that. Fatima, you wanted to say something. Fatima is performing tomorrow night in the jury-selected showcases.
9:15.
Don't miss it.
Yes, thank you very much. There is so much to say that I don't know how to start.
Okay, well, try and keep it. I know someone of your experience, but try to make the comment short and end with a question. That would be the.
Okay, just to say.
Let's just carry on amongst ourselves.
Just to reivindicate maybe the term of vocal art, because we speak about singers, we speak about bel canto, and we are already so many singers that we are doing a very deep research on vocal cultures, very old, going to the sources of very old vocal cultures. That why should we be in the mask? Why should we be in the throat? We can combine. Finally, bel canto or lyric singing is a convention. It's one more convention. From centuries and centuries and centuries, there are hundreds of vocal cultures that singing with the throat. Then I invite the singers to make this research about how to combine throat singing with bel canto singing. And then, since voice is into the body, this will lead to all of us very far, because through the body we arrive to the performance art, because you are giving on stage what you are. You cannot avoid it. Yeah. So I invite singers not to have fear of not to be strictly in one vocal technique, academic or not academic. Doesn't matter. Vocal art, I think, is a very good term.
Let me ask you a question, and the answer is yes or no. No, seriously, are you optimistic?
Yes.
About what singers are about what they're learning?
Yes.
And how
totally,
they're learning.
Totally.
You are, yes, you are optimistic. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, with what I present on stage, you will realize my total confidence about it.
Kathy, can I just come to you for a general reaction? Kathy Boyd, founder, director of Cryptic Theatre, what was it, 20 years ago? Producer, festival director. I mean, what's your take on the discussion that you've heard this morning? Have we been missing crucial issues, do you think?
I don't necessarily think we've missed something. I think, to back up Elaine saying about Britain being very small, I think what I've always been aware of is Belgium has been so rich. Belgium has over 38 music theatre companies. They created a decree for music theatre. We haven't touched on that at all. And I think we look in awe of those many, many companies, not just Transparent and Laud, who are obviously the trailblazers, but I think certainly in the UK, we are way behind. And I think it's exciting what Sara's saying about Singapore. And I'm particularly interested, actually, when Peking Opera and music theatre will come together, because, that would be fascinating to see what comes out of that.
You could start with Huang Ruo's Kun opera, Paradise Interrupted. I mean, I think that's really trailblazing for Chinese opera and where that's going, the building and growing of new vocabularies.
But the houses in Europe who support this, it's very small. Yes, the Rotterdam here, the Schouwburg has given huge support, way back to Jan Zoet, who started Opera Days. Jerry Arts to Single. In the UK, Opera Music is still supporting a little bit music theatre, but it's very, very small.
One of the implications behind what you're saying could be that there's been a huge breakthrough in international exchange and information, but it could be that we're still not doing that enough, that we're not learning from each other enough. A 3-year degree course in music theatre. I mean, does everyone know that? Is everyone learning from this?
But the person I always refer young singers to is Paul Cook's course that he has here in the Netherlands, because it's incredibly successful. And actually, Paul Cook himself,
one of the great radical music theatre makers,
incredible man, and inspires so many young artists. So when you look at the performances that those students are doing, that's exciting. That's inspiring. But I have a question about music theatre, the term. I question if we're actually outdating ourselves. I'm very concerned at this. Attending the music theatre now, I wanted to ask, which I said to you at breakfast, the under 25-year-olds, what they think of that term, because I wonder, are we actually killing the audience? They just want an experience. And I think I'm very concerned that we still use this term music theatre. I think actually maybe in the future, should it all just be called performance? Should it just be called opera? Opera was the first multimedia art form. We mustn't forget that.
That's a very interesting point.
Dance, visual art, and music. Yeah. We just use our technologies now, but it's. I'm not so sure about this term long term.
Yeah, there's a couple of hands. I'm going to try and wrap this up because I know that people have to get on to other things, and I'm feeling extremely vulnerable here without experts on the right side. We've got one here.
I would contend you shouldn't feel vulnerable because you're sitting in a room full of experts.
Thank you.
I haven't really a coherent point to make, but I'm going to try anyway, which is very frustrating for everyone who has to listen. My name is Shirley Apthorpe. I write about opera for the Financial Times. I live in Germany and I run an organisation in South Africa where we make music theatre with young people, and I grew up and had my musical training in Australia. So I just wanted to respond in a more international context to some of the observations, picking up with the comment about the fact that conservatoriums are training people for a 19th century music world which no longer exists. And my experience is that is overwhelmingly the case. Just looking from South African perspectives there, the students already know they won't be able to make a living singing opera in South Africa. So they all... It's like the three sisters in the cherry orchard. They all hope, they yearn for Europe or
Moscow,
for America.
to Moscow.
To Moscow, sorry. Can't remember what I said. But they're largely trained from an American point of view. So they're all they have an incredibly conservative view of a future in opera. They're learning a limited selection of mostly Italian repertoire. And they're taught that new music is the loony fringe. And this is exacerbated by the fact that most new music in South Africa, I'm sorry, it's just not very good. I say that with all the arrogance of someone who lives in Berlin, so it's a very Eurocentric point of view.
You also write for the Financial Times.
Yeah. And so we have a whole generation of promising young singers who are starting to hit. And my urge with them is say, don't look at America, look at Germany. 1/3 of all the opera premieres in the world are happening in Germany. If you want work, it's still your best option. They can't live from singing new music productions in South Africa, and they probably won't be able to live from it in Germany. And they're very, very, very ill-equipped for contemporary music.
But isn't that sorry to interrupt you, but isn't that the core of the challenge that's been heard this morning about curricula, is that the all-round singer for today is not being equipped to take advantage of different opportunities that the new career
Not
very
even
different.
vaguely, and I see that as one of the biggest challenges for the future. We're training young people for a future that we can't even begin to imagine, and those of us who are doing the training are even less equipped to imagine the future because we're coming from the past. And we're training irresponsibly thousands of kids for a future they will never have, and equipping them with tools they will not need for the future.
Okay, thank you.
Very optimistic.
No, thank you. Jeroen?
Yeah, Joan Smits, programmer of classical music at a concert hall. I just had a question. Maybe it's a bit of a reactionary question as a response to you, but I was also wondering whether there is really a future for the unamplified voice, because now we've heard that it's very difficult, or that the route to a career is very conservative. The institutions are conservative, but if you look at the concert practice, like for instance in Holland, the market for art leader has basically collapsed. I find that newcomers to classical music find a classically trained voice very artificial, and I just wonder how much future there is left for the unamplified voice.
I'm going to bat that question right back to you. Isn't that your responsibility? I feel it's my responsibility, partly, to find an answer to that question.
Yeah.
I mean, so what's the answer? Aren't we really talking about a crisis of presentation skills? Or no, I don't mean for the singers. I don't mean for the singers, but for the programming we're doing.
Well, I really don't know if it's a problem you can solve just as an artist. I think the reasons for it are very diverse. And I think one of the things is also that everybody is used to an amplified voice. If you went to a bar 100 years ago and someone was singing, that person had to be someone who had trained their voice to make volume. Now someone picks up a microphone. So you cannot go back in time. So that's, for instance, one element we cannot change anymore.
It's a very dismal picture you're painting. Nicole has a comment.
Yeah, I actually want to respond to that, because part of what's happening is of course this movement into non-traditional spaces. I mean, the voice has changed because of the venues over time. I mean, I can sing early music, which requires a certain kind of voice. If you put me into a concert hall, I can sing with another kind of voice, depending on my support, i.e. what kind of orchestration I have. And now we're moving into, well, we're missing Beth, but she's talking about the black box. Well, it requires a different kind of singing. And I think that the desire to reach different audiences means a change of the art form.
So you're now an educator?
Yes. I don't teach voice.
No, okay, but,
but yeah.
sketch for us, just what a syllabus has to offer, the kind of singing which will make someone like Elaine feel motivated as a student.
We have similar experiences, I think.
Just invent a syllabus in a tiny few sentences.
Okay. Well, I think that it does require training the voice, understanding what the voice can do depending on different circumstances. Now that's very general. And actually we get back to Beth's point about at least in part by following the artist, and now I'm saying that the singer is the artist. What is their passion? What do they see their future to be? That has to be in conjunction with their teacher or teachers. Should it just be one person? In the traditional setting, you have the kind of the apprentice, yeah, where one person works in one small room with with the teacher. And in fact, in my case, not to sort of bring up my traumas, but I wasn't allowed to sing outside of the studio for a long time. At the time, it was confronting and confining, but actually it did give me a lot of good training. So I had to be strong enough also as a singer in my own identity to be able to step out of that when I had the opportunity.
There's a word which we haven't used in this debate. Isn't what you were talking about, Elaine, doesn't that come down to essentially a question of values? That the conservatorium culture is based on very rigid values. And these values are not ones that you share unilaterally.
Well, some you understand and share and respect, but it's part of the self-development of an artist to find out what their values are and what they believe in, because that is what they're going to be pursuing and presenting and sharing. And that is part of the important development as a young artist in a conservatoire and post-conservatoire training, because often you graduate and then you're left to your own devices, and that's where mentoring and support is really important. But to add to Nicole's syllabus, thank you. Yeah, definitely. Training is really important. It ties in with what you were saying, and a lot of singers go years trying to find the right teacher, going through many different teachers, so much trauma. You have the wrong teacher, then you may have that golden moment of finding the right teacher that helps you at that particular moment of your life.
Development.
And training is important. Openness is important.
Okay.
And self-confidence and musicianship.
Right.
Because
Yes.
you need to have that to be able to sing anything.
Sara, sorry, you've been quiet for a little while. I have absolutely no idea what's being taught in Singapore on the vocal side. Tell us.
We only have one conservatory of music in Singapore, and it just celebrated its 11th birthday. And the voice department only started maybe about 3 to 4 years ago. So that's just to give you a little bit of context about how it's developing from the voice perspective in Singapore. So they go through the regular conservatory curriculum. And I totally agree with what someone had said earlier about, we are training musicians, not just vocalists, but musicians in a way that may or may not be useful in presentations for the future. And I think the conservatory in Singapore very much also suffers that.
Well, yeah, to be cynical about
path.
it, I mean, they designed the conservatism in the course if it's only 12 years old.
Yeah, and specific to Singapore, it's very much stuck in its ivory tower, and there's a certain form of academic music that only academics and scholars and new musicians listen to and want to be able to continue to promote. But as a promoter and as a presenter myself, I have to be the bridge between the program and the audience. And Singapore audiences are far from being able to readily accept this or find it accessible to some degree. So that's my role.
Okay, I think we have to move towards a wrap-up now. Fatima, yours.
I think it's not a problem, amplification or not amplification. Many people think that singers, we sing with our vocal cords, but vocal cords is the end of the way. It's the very, very end. We sing with air, and we don't do nothing if we have fantastic vocal cords, but we don't have the listening, the right ear, and the right breathing. So, training. I believe deeply in repetition. I have been studying in India. I remember I was crazy repeating the same scale during 7 hours. I wanted to kill my master. But I didn't understand what I was doing there at that moment. Oh my God, I can go to Spain. What am I doing here? And then when I came back to Spain after a full year there, I realized what I have learned. Repetition, because then it's the intelligence of your body who understands. Then, in relation with amplification or not amplification, there is no dogma. In my case, I employ very different vocal techniques that I combine to the service of the idea, to the service of the poetry. When people ask me to sing in a church, in a museum where there is marble, granite, and wonderful reverberation, I prepare one repertoire. And when I sing in a theater, black box, which is quite dry, I need amplification. And then, for instance, if I want to do, it's better to have amplification. But if I will do, it's no problem not to have amplification. So you have to choose, you have to sing with the architecture. And if they oblige you to sing opera, a certain repertoire, in a place that it is not for you, then you refuse it. That is all. We cannot say yes. Every proposal.
What you're doing is opening up a complete world which has to be debated. And again, guys, just go and see this lady performing. Please go. I'm going to do something very naughty now and tell you that 185 submissions for the Classical Next jury for showcases. There were 2 which had a unanimous high score on this person must be in the showcase, and Fatima was one of them.
Thank you.
So do go. I'm not allowed to tell you that, but I don't care. But the serious part, I'm going to finish up now. I really am going to finish up. But what I'm going to suggest is I've suddenly realised in the last half hour, we've been talking about nothing except the voice. And I actually believe that in Classical Next 2017 that there should be a conference session about the new voice. I am not going to put that proposal in myself, but I'm just going to throw this idea out. You've got another 2 days to develop this idea with all your colleagues and friends. I think there's a very rich discussion topic in there about training singers and the voice of the 21st century and so on. And if you don't mind, I would suggest we now close it on that note. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to you as well. It's 2 hours, huh?